King Robert Baratheon stood by the window of his chambers in King's Landing, eyes lost in thought. The heat of the capital had always made him irritable, but tonight it wasn't the heat that made his blood boil. It was the truth that his son Joffrey wasn't really his. He had ignored it for years, pretended not to see the golden hair, the Lannister features, the smug arrogance in the boy's face. But it was eating at him now, worse than ever. Maybe it was Ned Stark's arrival that had woken something inside him, a memory of better days, of real loyalty, of truth. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around a goblet of wine. "Joffrey is not mine," he muttered under his breath, his voice like gravel. "He never was." Ned's words echoed in his mind. "You need to protect the realm from what's coming." That night, Robert didn't go to the whorehouse. He didn't get drunk to forget. Instead, he summoned a raven. "To Winterfell," he ordered. "Send this to Eddard Stark. Tell him I need his bastard." The news hit Ned like a hammer. Catelyn was furious when the raven came. "Jon Snow, the king wants Jon Snow. The king wants Jon Snow," she hissed, pacing. "Why? Why him?" But Ned didn't answer. He looked at the parchment again and again. Robert wanted Jon in King's Landing. Not as a ward, not as a squire, as heir. It made no sense, and yet it made perfect sense. Jon stood outside the hall when he was summoned. He came in quietly, his eyes shifting between his Lord Father and Lady Stark. She didn't look at him kindly, but that was nothing new. "You're to leave for King's Landing," Ned said plainly. Jon blinked. "Why?" "Because the king has called for you." Jon didn't understand, but he nodded. He always did what he was told. He didn't know that this journey would change everything. King's Landing was louder, filthier, and more dangerous than Jon had ever imagined. But Robert welcomed him like a long-lost son. The moment they stood face to face, Robert saw it. The boy had the look of a Stark, but there was something in his eyes. Fire. Not Lannister pride or Targaryen madness, but something real. "You look like your father," Robert said, clapping a heavy hand on Jon's shoulder. "But you got something he never had, ambition." Jon didn't understand the meaning behind those words then. He only nodded. But the court noticed, and the queen noticed most of all. Cersei's lips curled the moment she saw the bastard walking beside her husband. "He's lowborn," she said bitterly to Robert in private. "He has no name, no claim. He has no name. He has mine now," Robert growled. "I name him Jon Snow Baratheon." Cersei's eyes widened. She knew what this meant. If Robert named Jon as heir, Joffrey's future was gone, and if the truth came out about her and Jaime, then her head might follow. Joffrey threw a fit. He smashed goblets, screamed at his mother, demanded answers. "You are the crown prince," Cersei whispered to him in the dark. "That bastard will not take what is yours." But Jon didn't seek the crown. He didn't even know why he had been chosen. He trained daily with the sword, studied history and the laws of the realm, stayed quiet during court meetings. Yet people began to talk. The commoners liked him. The lords were curious. He was humble, respectful, and brave, unlike Joffrey, who had grown into a cruel little boy with a love for hurting others. Jon missed the north. He missed Ghost. But something told him he was meant to be here. Then came the day Robert made it official. In front of the court he stood tall and booming, drunk but clear-eyed. "I, Robert of House Baratheon, King of the Andals and the First Men, hereby name Jon Snow as my legal heir." The court gasped. Littlefinger raised an eyebrow. Varys smiled a thin, unreadable smile. Cersei stood frozen. Joffrey looked ready to kill. And Jon, he was stunned. Robert turned to him and said, "You are my son now, boy. The realm needs a real king, not a golden-haired brat." But that was the moment everything began to crack. because Cersei Lannister would never let her son be replaced without a fight, and Jon Snow had just been thrown into a game far more dangerous than he could imagine. The halls of the Red Keep had never felt more dangerous. Since King Robert declared Jon Snow as his heir, tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The lords of the realm whispered in corners, unsure of how to react. The king's decision had overturned years of assumption. Joffrey, the crowned prince, had just been disinherited in front of the whole court. But Jon didn't walk with pride. He walked with caution. He felt the stares. The servants bowed lower. The guards addressed him differently. But behind every polite word, Jon could feel it: resentment, suspicion, fear, and worse, envy. Queen Cersei barely acknowledged him now. When she did, her words were sugar-coated poison. "Tell me, Jon," she said one morning as they crossed paths near the gardens, her smile thin as paper, "do bastards in the north often find themselves playing prince in King's Landing?" Jon bowed respectfully. "No, Your Grace. I suppose I'm the first." She leaned in slightly, voice sharp and low, "and the last, if the gods are kind." Jon kept his face still. He had learned early, especially from Catelyn Starkow, to swallow pride and wear silence like armor. But Cersei wasn't the only danger. Joffrey had changed. The boy who once taunted but kept his distance was now unpredictable. Every time Jon entered the training yard, Joffrey was there, watching, eyes filled with a mix of hate and fear. "Think you're a lord now?" Joffrey spat once after practice, sweat gleaming on his brow. "You'll never be a real Baratheon. You're just a snowflake pretending to be a crown." Sir Barristan stepped between them before Jon could respond. But the look in Joffrey's eyes said enough. He would not forget, and he would not forgive. Still, Robert remained firm. He drank more than ever, perhaps to numb the political fires he had lit, but he didn't take back his decision. "The realm needs someone with honor," he told Jon one night in the Great Hall, "not some silk-stuffed brat raised by a lioness." Jon wanted to ask why me, but the words stayed in his throat. He knew Robert missed Lyanna. He knew the guilt still haunted him. Maybe Jon was a shadow of a past he couldn't fix, or maybe he was just the only starred blood Robert could reach. Then came the small council meeting. Varys, ever calm, folded his fingers. "Your Grace, it is unusual to place a bastard as heir." The lords grew restless. Littlefinger smirked. "And what would stop them from backing your other son? Joffrey is still considered legitimate by most." Robert slammed his goblet down. "I don't care what most believe. I know what's true." Varys raised an eyebrow. "Truth, Your Grace, is rarely stronger than perception." That night, Jon received a note under his chamber door. No signature, just words written in elegant ink. "You're being watched. Trust no one, not even the ones who smile." He held the note over a candle and burned it slowly, eyes flicking to the shadows in the corners of the room. Someone in the castle was warning him, but who? The next morning, he woke to news that shook the capital. One of Robert's bastards, an infant girl living in Fleabottom, had been found dead, poisoned. Jon felt sick. Sir Barristan didn't meet his eyes. "It was no accident," the old knight said. "This is a message. The Queen, she's cleaning the board." Jon didn't say a word. He went to the king immediately. Robert was drunk as usual. "Let me go back north," Jon said. "Let me go to the wall. I was never meant to be here." Robert's eyes were bloodshot. "You think you can run from this? You think you're safer in the snow?" He grabbed Jon's shoulder hard. "You're the only one I trust. You'll stay." Jon nodded slowly, but in his heart he knew something terrible was coming. They were already sharpening knives in the dark, and Cersei Lannister would rather burn the realm than let a bastard wear the crown. The capital breathed rumors like fire. Servants whispered that Queen Cersei was planning something ruthless. Lords walked more cautiously now, unsure where their loyalty should lie, and Jon Snow, once just a forgotten boy from the north, now found himself the center of a storm he never asked for. He couldn't sleep most nights. His chamber, though finely furnished and guarded, felt like a cage. Each knock on the door made his hand slide toward the dagger under his pillow. He'd started noticing things: servants replaced without notice, eyes watching him during meals, food left untouched because he feared it might be his last. Sir Barristan Selmy remained close, his silent protection a comfort. "Do not eat anything you haven't seen prepared," the old knight advised quietly. "And speak little. These walls carry voices." Jon nodded. He trusted Sir Barristan. The man carried honor like armor, but even steel couldn't shield him from what came next. The assassination attempt happened at dusk. Jon was walking through the royal gardens, one of the few places in the castle where he could breathe. The scent of roses and damp earth always reminded him of Winterfell. Ghost padded beside him, alert as always. That's when he heard the softest shuffle, a whisper of movement behind the hedges. Ghost growled. Jon turned just in time to dodge the dagger flying at his neck. A cloaked figure burst from the shadows, fast, trained. He lunged again, blade flashing. Jon rolled, drew his short sword, and parried just as the attacker aimed for his ribs. Steel clashed. Ghost leapt, fangs bared, and tackled the man to the ground. The assassin screamed as the direwolf tore into his arm. Guards rushed in. The attacker tried to flee but was caught and dragged, bloodied, to the dungeons. Jon stood, breathing hard, hands trembling. He had just survived his first real attempt on his life. When Robert heard, he was silent for a long time. Then, quietly, he said, "Cersei." Ned Stark had warned him, and now that warning tasted bitter. Later that night, Robert summoned Jon privately. "You should have gone to the wall, boy," the king muttered. "You were right to want out." "I still can," Jon said. "You can send me away before it's too late." But Robert shook his head. "It's already too late." He looked older than ever, his face heavy with regret. "You're my last shot at making something right. I've spent my life chasing women, wine, and war, and all I've done is leave a broken realm." He stepped closer to Jon. "You remind me of your father. Ned's never wanted power either. That's why he deserved it." Jon swallowed. "I don't know how to rule." "You'll learn," Robert said, clapping his hand on Jon's shoulder. "Or you'll die trying." Meanwhile, in the Queen's chambers, rage burned. Cersei paced like a lioness in a cage, her hand bleeding from a shattered goblet. He survived. Maester Pycelle tried to calm her, but she waved him off like a fly. "Do you know what happens if that bastard takes the throne? Everything I've built, everything Jaime and I have done gone." She turned to Joffrey, who sat sulking. "You were supposed to be king," she hissed. "Not him." Joffrey looked up. Then, "Kill him." The words were cold, too cold for a boy his age. Cersei stared, and then slowly a smile curved her lips. "Yes," she said, "we will." The next morning, Lord Tywin Lannister arrived in King's Landing. He hadn't been summoned, but he knew. Robert cursed when he heard the news. The lions come down from the rock. That means one thing: he smells war. Jon stood behind the throne during court that day, watching Tywin stride in with golden armor and cold eyes. "I heard there's been confusion about succession," Tywin said, bowing only slightly. "I thought I should offer clarity. Robert didn't rise. There's no confusion. My heir stands right there." Tywin's jaw twitched. "A bastard has no place on the throne." "He does when he has my name," Robert snapped. The room froze. Tywin's eyes slid to Jon. No fear, no welcome, just calculation. He turned back to the king. Then I hope you're prepared for what comes next. Because now, Jon wasn't just a target. He was the spark that could ignite a civil war. The raven flew fast and far. From King's Landing to the farthest lords of the realm, the message was the same. War was coming. The declaration of Jon Snow as heir to the Iron Throne had cracked the fragile peace that barely held Westeros together. Now the great houses began to choose sides, not just between Robert and the Lannisters, but between truth and lies, between blood and name. And in the center of it all stood Jon Snow, no longer just a bastard boy from the north, but a symbol of rebellion, of legitimacy, of danger. But Jon did not feel powerful. He felt hunted. Every day at court became a performance. He wore fine clothes, but kept his hand near his blade. He smiled politely, but never trusted the eyes that met his. Spies filled the hall like rats, and every piece of food he ate passed through a taster. Ghost followed him closely now, never leaving his side. The direwolf sensed it before Jon did something was creeping closer. Death. Meanwhile, Lord Tywin Lannister wasted no time. He sent ravens to the Reach, the Westerlands, and even across the narrow sea. His message was clear. If Robert would crown a bastard, then the realm needed a real king, one with blood and name and legacy. He summoned Jaime from the King's Guard and sent him west to rally troops. But Cersei had other plans that didn't involve armies. She met secretly with Grand Maester Pycelle and then with Lord Baelish, whispering promises of power and coin. One name kept rising in their conversations: Varys. The spider heard everything. If Jon Snow were to be removed, it would take more than a sword. It would take silence, shadow, and strategy. "Make it look like an accident," Cersei said, voice low, eyes sharp. "No blade, no blood, no blood, no proof." Littlefinger only smiled. A prince lost to a fever is tragic. A prince lost to a dagger? That's treason. Robert Baratheon, for once in his life, tried to be a king. He cancelled the hunt. He held council every day, though half the lords in the room wished him dead. He sent envoys north, hoping to gain the full support of House Stark. But he also drank, more than usual. One night, stumbling through his chamber, he turned to Jon with tears in his eyes. "I should have been a better man," he muttered. "A better king. If I had married your aunt, if I had done things right." Jon stayed quiet. He didn't know what to say. "You're my second chance," Robert said, gripping his shoulder. "Don't fail like I did." But Jon wasn't sure if he wanted to succeed. Every step deeper into this world made him feel like he was drowning. Then came the poisoning. It happened during breakfast. The cup coughing violently. Ghost howled as he collapsed, gasping, his vision blurred. The pain in his gut was like fire. Chaos erupted. Servants screamed. Guards rushed in. Maester Pycelle arrived, too slow and too calm. But Jon didn't die. Sir Barristan had acted fast. The old knight forced milk of the poppy down Jon's throat, and the younger apothecary, summoned by Arya Stark, who had grown close to Jon in the capital, poured an antidote brewed in secret. 3 days Jon lay in bed, burning with fever. For 3 days the Red Keep braced for a funeral, but on the 4th day Jon opened his eyes, alive. Robert was furious. "Who did this?" he roared. "I'll have their heads." But no proof could be found. The servant who poured the wine had vanished. The guards had seen nothing. The trail went cold. Only one note was left on Jon's bedside when he woke. "You were never meant to survive this game." That was the day Jon changed. He rose from bed, pale and still aching, but colder inside. The boy who had once begged to go to the wall was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone who realized he would either die as a pawn or rise as a king. He began to ask questions. About court, about Cower. How Thou'rt how kings truly ruled. He began to speak to Varys, to Littlefinger, even to Renly Baratheon, who had kept his distance until now. He wanted to understand the game, because if he didn't, he wouldn't survive the next round. Robert noticed it too. "You're not the same boy," he said one night. Jon looked out the window. That boy didn't know what poison tasted like. And far away in the north, Eddard Stark finally received the raven he'd been dreading. His son had almost died in the capital. He turned to his bannermen. "If they want war," Ned Stark said, "they'll find the North remembers." The North was stirring. For years it had kept to itself cold, quiet, proud. But when news reached Winterfell that Jon Snow, Ned Stark's blood, had been poisoned in the Red Keep, something ancient awakened in the old stones. Whispers of war turned into war cries. Lords who had once dismissed Jon as the bastard boy now rallied under House Stark's banner. He was one of theirs, and the South had tried to kill him. Ned Stark rode out from Winterfell with a face carved from ice. He brought with him the great houses of the North Karstark, Umber, Mormont. Even old Lord Wyman Manderley sent ships south. Jon had bled for their honor. Now they would march for his survival. But Ned's heart was heavy. He didn't just ride to protect Jon. He rode because he knew who had poisoned him, and he feared what Jon would become if he lived long enough to wear the crown. In King's Landing, Jon recovered too fast. Some whispered, but the poison had done something deeper than scar his body. It sharpened him, hardened him. The naive boy who once stared at statues of kings now stared at the men who wanted to be king, and he saw weakness. He moved with quiet purpose, avoiding courtyards and crowded halls. Ghost never left his side. He met often with Varys now, asking questions the boy version of himself wouldn't have dared ask. Who controls the city watch? Who funds the crown's debts? Who do the small folk really follow? Varys smiled his thin, eerie smile. "You're learning." Jon nodded. "I don't want to rule like Robert." "Then don't," Varys said. "Rule like a Stark, or like something else entirely." Cersei was unraveling. The failed assassination had exposed a cruel truth. Jon was harder to kill than she'd thought, and Robert's drunken defiance kept fueling the fire. He refused to back down, even as House Lannister tightened its grip on the Westerlands. "You need to control him," Tywin warned her, "before the bastard controls the realm." But Cersei had her own plans. She reached out to Stannis Baratheon. The letter was short. "Your brother has betrayed your blood. He names a northern bastard as heir. Come to King's Landing. Come take what's yours." She sent the raven without telling Robert, or Joffrey, or even Tywin. She was done waiting. Jon stood on the ramparts one evening, overlooking Blackwater Bay. The wind tugged at his cloak. He heard someone approach. It was Arya. "I heard they tried to kill you," she said. "They did," Jon replied simply. "I would have killed them first." He smiled. "I know you would have." Arya hesitated, then asked, "Why didn't you come home when it got bad?" Jon turned to her. "Because home doesn't exist anymore. Not for me." Arya didn't argue. She just stood beside him, quiet. She understood more than most. Jon looked out toward the sea. "I'm going to do things they don't expect, things I might not be proud of." "Good," Arya said. "That's how you survive." Later that week, Jon walked into the throne room during court and did something no one expected. He knelt before Robert. "My king," he said, "I ask for leave to raise a banner of my own, not as a Stark, not as a Snow, as a Baratheon." The court erupted into whispers. Robert raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, boy?" Jon stood. "I will be your heir. I will fight your enemies, but I can't be a shadow of another man's name. Give me a new one. Let me start something clean." Robert was silent for a long moment. Then he laughed, a deep, booming laugh that echoed off the throne room walls. "Very well," he said. "From this day you are Jon of House Stormwolf, founder of a new line, my line, Stormwolf." The bastard had just become a prince with his own house, and everyone in the court knew what that meant. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was building something dangerous. Meanwhile, in the Westerlands, ravens flew out from Casterly Rock. The lions were preparing to strike, and at Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon read the Queen's letter with cold eyes and a tighter grip on his sword. The drums of war began to beat. From the frozen valleys of the north to the scorching coasts of Dragonstone, Westeros was shifting. Lines were being drawn, oaths tested, and the Game of Thrones, already soaked in blood, was ready to be played in fire. At the heart of it all stood Jon Stormwolf. No longer snow, no longer nameless. A new sigil was stitched across his chest as silver wolf beneath a storm cloud, eyes burning with fury. A new house had been born, and with it new loyalty and new enemies. King Robert had given his blessing, but not all blessings were enough to hold back the tide. His decision to name Jon heir had split the realm like a sword through rotten fruit. Some lords stayed loyal, others waited. But the most dangerous were those who had already chosen another king. Stannis Baratheon had answered Cersei's call, and he was coming. The Raven reached King's Landing at dawn. Jon stood beside Robert as the message was read aloud in the throne room. "Lord Stannis marches south with 10,000 men," the herald announced. "He claims the Iron Throne by right of blood and declares your heir, Jon Stormwolf, an impostor and insult to the gods." Robert said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to Jon and said, "He was always too righteous for his own good." Jon's jaw tightened. "He's not wrong about the law." "No," Robert admitted, "but the law doesn't win wars. Soldiers do." Jon didn't flinch. "Then we should prepare for one." Cersei, watching from her balcony, smiled as she heard the court erupt in argument. Let them tear each other apart. What she hadn't expected, though, was Jaime returning to King's Landing sooner than planned. She met him in her private chambers, away from spying eyes. "Stannis marches," she said. "Robert will fight, and Jon will die in the mud. All we need to do is stay still and let it happen." Jaime frowned. "And what of Joffrey?" "He waits. When the dust settles, he'll rise. With the Stormwolf and the Stag gone, who else is left?" But Jaime wasn't so sure. "Jon's not a fool. He's Ned Stark's blood. If we underestimate him," Cersei's eyes narrowed, "then we kill him before the battle starts." Jon, meanwhile, was preparing differently. He had learned by now that the sword was only half the battle. He needed alliances. He began writing letters north to House Mormont, west to the Riverlands, even one to Dorne. He offered something rare, a future shaped by honor, not greed. A king who would bleed for his people. But the most important letter he sent was to Robb Stark. "Brother," he wrote, "I never asked for this, but I won't wrung from it. The Lannisters want me dead. Stannis calls me false. But I remember who I am. I need you, not as a Stark, as my brother." Back in Winterfell, Robb read the letter with clenched fists. He had grown into a man since Jon left, taller, hardened by responsibility, and he had always loved Jon more than any true brother. Catelyn warned him. "He is not your blood. He is more than that," Robb said. "He is my brother in everything that matters." And so the young wolf began to march south with the full force of the north behind him. Back in King's Landing, another plan was forming. Littlefinger approached Jon quietly one night as the prince studied a map of Blackwater Bay. "You're brave," he said, "honorable, but too many men have died with honor and a blade in their belly." Jon didn't look up. "What do you want?" "To help you win." Jon raised an eyebrow. Littlefinger smiled. Let Stannis march. Let him take the field. But you don't need to fight a war to win one. Just break it from the inside. Jon stared. You want me to betray Robert? No, Littlefinger said smoothly. I want you to survive him. And with that, he left, planting a seed Jon would try to ignore but couldn't. Days later, the royal horns blared across the city. Jon rode beside Robert at the head of a growing army. The banners of Baratheon and the new Stormwolf snapped in the wind. The city watched them leave, unsure if they would ever return. Arya stood on the city walls as Jon rode out. She didn't wave. He looked back once, just once, and saw her there. No goodbyes. Just steel. Far off, on a burning shore near Shipbreaker Bay, Stannis stood with fire dancing in his eyes. Beside him stood a red woman cloaked in shadow. The bastard prince marches to war, she said. Stannis didn't blink. Then he marches to his death. And behind them, a massive fire roared where a statue of the Seven burned, melted into ash. The gods were watching, and they would show no mercy. The sky over the Stormlands turned dark with ash and omen. Jon Stormwolf had never seen war, not truly, not like this. The fields near Blackhaven, once green and open, were now crawling with soldiers, camps, and sharpened stakes. The banners of House Baratheon flapped alongside the new silver wolf he now bore, but even those colors couldn't hide what loomed ahead. Stannis Baratheon was coming, and with him, fire. Jon stood inside the command tent with King Robert, Sir Barristan, and a dozen lords. Most of them were veterans, men who had fought in Robert's rebellion, but none of them looked certain now. He marches with fewer men, Robert muttered, pacing, but they're disciplined, trained, loyal to his cause like it's a damn religion. He also has that woman, one lord spat, the Red Priestess. Sir Barristan nodded grimly. Melisandre of Asshai. She's no mere advisor. They say she burned a sept on the first night of the march. Jon spoke for the first time in a while. Do we fight him head-on? Robert turned. Would you? Jon hesitated. Stannis fights like the North straight and cold, but fire burns when it's underestimated. Robert grinned. Well said, boy. Ned would have liked that. But even as they planned, Jon couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. Not war. Something darker. That night, the wind changed. Jon was walking the perimeter of camp with Ghost when he saw it a flicker of flame on a distant hill, then another, and another. Within moments, the horizon was lit with hundreds of fires, not campfires, pyres. Jon felt it in his chest, a sick churn. He turned to find Sir Davos Seaworth, who had snuck into their camp under a banner of truce. You shouldn't be here, Jon said, hand drifting to his sword. I bring warning, not steel, Davos said quickly. Stannis has seen visions. The Red Woman fills his head with fire and prophecy. She says you're the false king, a shadow born of lies. And he believes it. Jon narrowed his eyes. Why tell me this? Davos sighed. Because I've seen too many good men die for pride and madness, and I don't want to see you burned alive. Jon's breath caught. Burned? She says your blood is king's blood. Says the flames demand a sacrifice. Jon stepped back. She wants to sacrifice me? Davos nodded. She claims the fire will crown Stannis when your ashes blow through the wind. The next day, the battle lines formed. Jon rode with Robert at the center, armored in black and silver. Ghost stalked the edges like a ghostly warg. Across the field stood Stannis stoic, silent, unreadable. Beside him stood Melisandre, eyes glowing unnaturally red, a strange smile playing on her lips. She didn't look at Robert, she looked only at Jon. Robert turned to him. Stay close today, boy. I won't lose you like I lost everything else. Jon nodded, gripping his sword tighter. The horns blew, and the storm broke loose. The battlefield turned to chaos. Steel clashed, arrows screamed, men shouted and died. Fire flared on the flanks where Melisandre had ordered her archers to shoot flaming arrows soaked in oils. Robert's left collapsed first, then the center held as Sir Barristan cut down wave after wave of armored men. Jon fought like a wolf, silent, efficient, brutal. His blade danced through the mud, and Ghost tore down any horse or man who got too close. Blood painted his armor, but Jon didn't feel fear. Not until he saw her. Melisandre walked through the carnage untouched like fire, couldn't touch her. She raised her hands to the sky and screamed in a language Jon didn't know. A black shadow erupted from the ground. It looked like Jon, but taller, twisted, eyes like molten gold. "What is that?" a knight screamed. Jon didn't answer. He charged it. Steel passed through it like smoke. The shadow raised its hand and knocked Jon back with a force that felt like 10 horses trampling him. Ghost leapt, but the shadow simply vanished. Melisandre laughed from a distance. "You cannot fight fate, bastard." But Jon rose, blood in his mouth, sword in hand. "I'm not fighting fate," he growled. "I'm breaking it." And he ran toward her. On the other side of the field, Robert smashed through Stannis' guard. "Brother!" he roared. "Come face me." But Stannis refused. He stared only at Jon and said, "Kill the false king." Like the world anew, smoke choked the sky. Men screamed, steel sang. Fire danced along the battlefield like a living curse. The war between brothers had become a war of gods, and at the heart of it all, Jon Stormwolf ran toward death. Melisandre stood at the edge of the chaos, her red robes untouched by ash or blood, as though the fire obeyed her. The ground cracked beneath her as she raised both hands, chanting words in a forgotten tongue. Her eyes locked on Jon with the intensity of a predator. "You are a shadow, Jon Snow," she called out. "A mistake. A lie." Jon kept coming, even as his limbs ached and his blood soaked through his armor. Ghost circled behind her, silent, teeth bared. "I may be a mistake," Jon said, sword trembling in his hand, "but I'm real." She smiled too calmly. "Then let's see if you burn like one." She thrust her hands toward him, and a wave of fire exploded from the ground, spiraling toward him like a dragon's breath. Jon closed his eyes, expecting the heat, but Ghost leapt in first. The direwolf howled as flames consumed his fur, biting into Melisandre's throat with his final breath. She screamed, not just in pain, but in terror as blood poured from her neck. The fire died with her scream, and just like that, the shadow the demon made in Jon's image vanished into smoke. Jon dropped to his knees beside Ghost's smoldering body. He didn't cry. He just laid a hand on the creature's head. "You saved me," he whispered, like always. Behind him, the battlefield shifted. The Red Woman's death sent a shock through Stannis' ranks. His men faltered. Some dropped their swords and ran. Others screamed that the Lord of Light had abandoned them. Stannis himself watched from a ridge, his cold expression cracking for the first time. He turned away from Robert's approach, his sword lowered. Robert charged him anyway. "Stannis!" the king bellowed, crashing into his brother's guards like a warhammer. The brothers finally faced one another, surrounded by corpses and fire. "You're no king," Robert snarled, swinging his axe. "And you were never fit to rule," Stannis spat, meeting his blow with steel. The duel was brutal rage against righteousness. Robert's power shook the ground with every strike, but Stannis was faster, more precise. They wounded each other again and again, blood dripping onto the mud. But in the end, Robert's rage won. With a final roar, he knocked Stannis' sword aside and buried his axe deep into his brother's shoulder. Stannis gasped, eyes wide. "The realm needs law, and it needed love too," Robert whispered, twisting the axe. "You gave it neither." Stannis fell lifeless. The Baratheon brothers, once united in rebellion, were now parted forever by war. Jon rose slowly from Ghost's body. His limbs trembled, his sword dragged behind him. He looked across the battlefield. It was over. The flames were dying, the screams fading. The armies of Stannis were broken, scattered, surrendering. The Lord of Light's grip had been severed. And yet, Jon didn't feel victory. He felt hollow. He walked through the battlefield alone, passing burned corpses, shattered banners, broken armor. He didn't wave to the cheering men. He didn't stop for the maesters tending wounds. He found Robert slumped on a rock, arm bleeding, face pale. "Your brother?" Jon asked. "Dead," Robert rasped. They didn't speak for a while. Then Robert looked at him with tired eyes. "This was never supposed to be your fight." Jon shook his head. "It always was. You just didn't see it soon enough." Robert laughed weakly. "You sound like Ned." "I hope so." The king coughed. Blood touched his lips. "I'm dying, Jon." "No, I am," Robert said firmly. "That blade Stannis got me deep. No maester will fix this." Jon stood frozen. Robert grabbed his forearm. "Don't let the lions take the crown. Don't let the realm fall back into their claws." Jon nodded, jaw clenched. "You are my son," Robert whispered. "Not of blood, but of choice. That's stronger." Then his hand went still. King Robert Baratheon was dead. A week later, Jon stood before the Iron Throne, not as a prince, not as a bastard, but as king. The lords bent the knee, some out of loyalty, others out of fear. Robb Stark arrived days later, embracing Jon without a word. Arya stood beside him, not in a dress but armed, quiet, watching everything. Sir Barristan placed the crown on Jon's head. "Long live the king," he said. Jon looked out at the court, at the nobles, the liars, the backstabbers, the few honest faces, and he said nothing, because Jon Snow had fought the fire, but he knew the real war was just beginning.